Hello everyone, today we're ranking ethical frameworks and moral frameworks. Now we're gonna use some objective measures like is it a complete framework and how intuitive is it? But of course personal preference and ideas are gonna influence this as well. First up we got consequentialism. Basically ethical actions and moral actions can be split into three parts, which are intention, the actual action, and consequences. And consequentialism says that, well, we should look at only the consequences of said action. Intention doesn't matter, nor does the actual action. Like, no one action is bad, only the consequences that result from it can determine whether it was good or bad. Now, of course, the first criticism that many people come up with is, let's say a thief goes to a store and he knocks over a candle and the candle goes out and he robs half the store's items. If he didn't go and rob half the store's items, he wouldn't have knocked over the candle and the candle wouldn't have gone out, and that simultaneously that same night the candle would have lit the whole place ablaze and everything would have burned down. So in actuality the actions of the thief were good because only half of the items are now gone instead of 100%. Now of course that doesn't seem very intuitive, and most of us would say that that doesn't make the action right. The action of stealing is still wrong, and there's a lot of other examples that use a similar frame. Also, I think it's very intuitive for us to care about not just the consequences of an ethical action, but the intention. So if somebody wants to do good and they truly believe that they are doing good and they, for example, kick a football because they're just trying to score a goal, their intention wasn't to kick that football into a window, yet it might hit a window. But if somebody intentionally kicks a football into a window, we would treat that a lot more harshly. So I don't think consequentialism is very intuitive from a human's perspective. Also, consequentialism isn't a complete framework, because even though it says that we should look at the consequences, it doesn't actually state which consequences are good and which are bad. So consequentialism does not define good and bad, which is in a sense what we are looking for in a moral framework. So because of those reasons, I'm personally gonna put consequentialism in the C tier. Next up on the list is egoism. Moral egoism is the view that whatever actions benefit you are good and whatever actions don't benefit you or cause harm to you are bad. So it already defines good and bad at least more than consequentialism, so we must give it that. It also seems probably more intuitive to at least some people, because many of us truly act what is best for us and then try to rationalize it later on. Now of course there's the problems of, well, what if this includes sacrificing 10,000 people just for your benefit? So I don't think it's quite intuitive in the sense that most people wouldn't want to sacrifice 10,000 people for your own little pleasure, even though in egoism that might be rational. Especially if there's no consequences to you sacrificing 10,000 people. So it definitely isn't the most intuitive, but it has some realism behind it. A lot of people do act upon their own benefit, even if it's immoral, even if they admit that it's immoral. So we must truly ask, well, do they believe that it's actually immoral, or maybe they're just saying that it's immoral, but they truly in their deep self have a moral compass that values their own self more than, for example, someone else. Now of course, egoism doesn't define what is beneficial to you, so it actually assumes that you can decide what is beneficial to you, and in a sense what you consider beneficial to you is good and what you consider to be bad for you is bad. In total, I think I have to put egoism above consequentialism because it is a more complete framework. Even if it seems a more immoral framework, it still goes into a higher bracket. I'm gonna put it in the B tier. Now next up is ethical intuitism. Basically it just says that we all have an intuition for what is right and wrong, and that intuition is what we should listen to. So if our intuition tells that some action is bad, then it's bad. But if our intuition tells us that some action is good, then it is good. Now of course this is a very intuitive position, and in a sense it could be the basis for all other frameworks. All other frameworks simply try to explain our intuition for what is good and what is bad. And so all other frameworks could be based in ethical intuitivism. And also it is a complete framework in the sense that it clearly defines what is good and what is bad. Once again, what we feel like and what we have an intuition for being good is good, and what we have an intuition for being bad is bad. So I think this might be the first one that I'm gonna put in S tier. The fourth framework that we're gonna look at is natural ethics or evolutionary ethics. I'm gonna put them in the same category because they're very similar. Basically it states that what is natural is good and what isn't natural is bad. Or in the evolutionary side, it's what's good for us evolutionarily is good and what is bad for us evolutionarily is bad. Now these are very broad ideas and they can encompass a lot of different situations. For example, if we think about evolution being the most important thing, surely if there is a situation where even murder or stealing is beneficial for our evolution, then it would be moral. Once again, I think this is an, in a sense, intuitive position to take, because evolution and evolutionarily psychology and biology of course affects our brain as well, and our intuitions and thoughts. So in many ways our intuitions of what's right and wrong come through evolution. We've learned through evolution that valuing life is better than not valuing life, because people who didn't value life didn't survive this long. And so it has some basis in it. But of course in many ways I think it goes against our intuition as well. Especially because I think there's a lot of situations where people wouldn't want to do the evolutionarily beneficial thing. For example, most people don't want to have 200 children, even though that's evolutionarily a lot better than having only 2 children. In the same way, if we look at just what's natural and what's not natural, well, antibiotics are not very natural, yet most people would say that antibiotics are a good invention and they help save a lot of lives. Even though it's a complete framework and it clearly defines what is right and what is wrong, I'm gonna have to put it in the B tier. Next up is pragmatic ethics. Basically what it tells us is that what's better is what's pragmatic, more practical. It also can mean that when we're making moral laws, no matter which framework we use, it should be practical in the sense that we can reinforce it. For example, saying that it's immoral to eat ice cream during night time is probably a bad moral law because it's extremely hard to enforce, probably impossible, because who's gonna watch out for other people eating ice cream at night when they're home alone? And so it can mean multiple things, but let's look at it from the ethical framework point of view, where the more practical something is, the better it is. Now once again, unlike consequentialism, it does define what is good and bad, because it does define good as what's more practical, pragmatic, but it does lack in the goals. What is the goal that we're supposed to reach? In a sense, if you think about it, like, yes, pragmatic things are better than non-pragmatic things, but what is the goal that we're supposed to work towards? Because depending on the goal, we might need to use different tools, and different tools are more pragmatic in different situations. So it doesn't actually define a real goal for us, which then would give us the actual complete framework that we would want. For example, if your goal is to build as many houses as possible, then getting a crane might be very good. But if your goal is to avoid houses at all costs, then a crane is not going to do any good for you. And pragmatic ethics doesn't define what is the goal that you're supposed to reach. And for that reason, I want to put it in the A tier. Social contract, this moral framework or ethical framework, is based on the idea that we make social contracts and we agree on what is good and what is bad, and based on that, some things are either good or bad. Now, of course, it's not complete in the sense that it in itself defines what is good and bad, because that could change. Depending on the social contract that we make, we could have two different social contracts which are totally opposite to each other. So it doesn't actually define what's good and bad. It simply states that we should make social contracts and then follow them, which I guess is fine, but I think it kind of misses the point. Usually we're trying to use a moral framework to build a social contract and use that moral framework as the basis for, okay, what are you allowed to do in this social interaction with me? Like, are you allowed to punch me? Are you allowed to spit on me? Or are you gonna shake my hand? And so it kind of skips that step, which is pretty important. And so it's definitely somewhat lacking, yet it's open to a lot of different possibilities. So I'm personally gonna put it in the C tier. Now, utilitarianism, the view that you should always make the action that causes more good than the action that causes more bad. I mean, pretty simple. But once again, it's not a complete framework because it doesn't define what is good and what is bad. So utilitarianism in itself is not a complete framework, and then we need to look at, well, what is this good that we're looking for? Is it well-being? Is it happiness? And then look at the actions which leads to the most amount of that. And if we don't choose what is this metric that we're using, is it happiness? Is it lack of pain or harm? Is it simply living the longest? Like, if we don't choose a metric, which utilitarianism doesn't choose for us by itself, utilitarianism is actually, in a sense, useless. Also, I think all ideas, all moral frameworks are, in a sense, utilitarian, that they all say that you should make the choice that is the best, but they all just depend on what they see as good and what they see as bad. But all frameworks, in a sense, are utilitarian, to where they value the most good choice over a worst choice. I also think there are practical problems with utilitarianism. I think you might have heard the very common example of, well, if you go and ask a utilitarian, why aren't you going and donating all your organs? I mean, you're gonna die, but you might save like 5 people. Surely that is better. And most of them won't go and do it because they either make up something like, oh, well, it's not guaranteed, or then it just kind of proves that they're not actually working on a utilitarian framework, and it's maybe closer to egoism. And for these reasons, I personally just have to put it in the D tier. Next up, we got virtue ethics, basically saying that you should always do according to virtues, like, for example, telling the truth or being brave, no matter the consequences. So if you go back and look at the 3 ways that you can split a moral action, there's the intention, action, and consequences. And consequentialism was that we look at only the consequences. And virtue ethics is basically looking at the other 2. You don't care about consequences at all. You're supposed to tell the truth no matter the consequences. You're supposed to be brave no matter the consequences, and so on. Now, of course, it's not a complete framework in the sense that it doesn't tell us what the actual virtues are. It just tells us that we should follow these virtues, but it doesn't actually tell us all the virtues that we ought to follow. Now, of course, common virtues are doing good, speaking the truth, and being brave, and so on. and they're very intuitive. Also, virtue ethics is something that Aristotle liked, and for that reason I'm gonna bump it up and put it into the A tier. Now, the second last one. We're almost done. Deontology. Basically, it's a rule-based and an obligation or a duty-based ethic view. So basically, we're supposed to act according to our duties and rules. So if there is a duty that we must do, then we must do that no matter the consequences. And doing that duty and following our duties and rules are morally good, and breaking them is bad. That's basically the view. Now, of course, it's not a complete framework once again, because it lacks in, well, what are the duties that we have? What are the rules that we have? But in other ways, it's very similar to virtue ethics. For example, we could have the duty to tell the truth, and we could have the duty to help others, and so on. But once again, it's not a complete framework, but this time it's not even from Aristotle, so I'm gonna put it in the C tier. Now, last up, we got divine command. And so divine command is quite self-explanatory. There is some divine being, a deity, that commands us to do something, and that's the moral law that we should follow. It's something that most people do believe in, because most people are religious. And so, in a sense, you could say that it's very intuitive and natural to humans. It's also, in a sense, a complete framework that it defines good and bad. It defines that which a deity commands is good, and that which a deity doesn't command, or which a deity permits us to do, is bad. So it is a complete framework. Now, of course, you can question, well, why should we listen to this deity? And that's a fair question. There's also the same with a lot of these. Why should we care about, for example, consequence? If we're choosing consequentialism, why should we care about consequences? Why do we look at exactly consequences to determine an action? Or if we look at practicality, pragmatic ethics, why care about practicality? Like, you can always ask this question, and I think that is the biggest flaw with this one. It doesn't actually tell us why we should listen to a divine deity that gives us the command. But otherwise, I do think that it is a very rational and, in a sense, a complete framework. So I'm gonna throw that in the A tier. Well, that was that. Thanks a lot for watching, and be sure to let me know what is your favorite framework which you like to use, and if there's any frameworks that I missed in this video.